No one came to the paralyzed CEO's birthday. Nobody expected what the single dad did next. The candles were lit at 6:45. By 7, nobody had walked through the door. Marcus Hale sat at the head of a table set for 12 people. White plates, folded napkins, a small printed menu card at every place. The restaurant manager had done everything right. The centerpiece was a low arrangement of dark flowers, the kind that looked expensive without screaming it. The private room smelled of cedar and warm bread. Soft music came through a speaker somewhere above the crown molding. Everything was exactly the way Marcus had asked it to be. He sat in his wheelchair at the head of the table and watched the door. 7:15 came, then 7:30. The waiter, a young man named Carl who could not have been older than 22, came back 3 times to refill Marcus's water glass without being asked. Each time, he looked at the empty chairs and then looked somewhere else fast, the way people do when they are trying not to see something that is right in front of them. Marcus had sent 17 invitations. He had sent them 5 weeks in advance, which was more than enough time. He had used a proper service, the kind with thick paper envelopes and a return address printed in clean type. He had not texted. He had not used a group chat or a social media event page. He had done it the old way because he believed the old way still meant something. He had built his company the old way too. 23 years ago, Marcus Hale had owned 1 pickup truck, a cell phone with a cracked screen, and a list of 12 warehouses within 40 miles of his apartment that needed freight moved on short notice and could not find anyone reliable enough to do it. He was 30 years old, and he had nothing else. His father had died the winter before, leaving behind a small savings account and a note that said, simply, "Do not waste the years." Marcus had taken those words and turned them into the only plan he had. He called every warehouse on the list. He showed up on time. He moved what needed to be moved. He charged a fair price, and he came back the next day without being asked. Within 3 years, he had 6 trucks. Within 10, he had 64. By the time Marcus Hale turned 48, Hale Freight Solutions employed 312 people, operated across 9 states, and had just been valued at $40 million in a deal that made the regional business pages. People wrote about him. He gave speeches at chambers of commerce and economic development dinners. Younger men called him to ask how he had done it. He told them the same thing every time. Show up. Do the work. Do not cut corners. Be the person other people can count on when it matters. He believed that. He had built his whole life on it. Then one morning, 18 months ago, Marcus woke up and could not feel his legs. He thought at first that he had slept in a strange position. That happens sometimes. You wake up and one arm is numb, and you shake it out and it comes back. He tried to move. He could not. He tried again. He lay there in the gray morning light of his bedroom for what felt like a very long time before he reached for his phone on the nightstand and called for help. The doctors later told him it was a spinal stroke. A blood clot had cut off circulation to his spinal cord during the night. It was rare. It was not something he had done wrong. It was not something he could have prevented. The damage was permanent. He would not walk again. Marcus had heard difficult news before. He had sat in rooms where people told him things that were hard to accept. He had lost contracts, lost bids, lost employees he had counted on. He knew how to take a hit and keep standing. But nothing had prepared him for the particular silence that came with those words. Permanent, not walking, the rest of his life. He spent 4 months in a rehabilitation center. He learned how to use a wheelchair. He learned how to move through a world that had not been built with him in mind. He learned which bathrooms had doors wide enough, which restaurants had steps at the entrance, which of his old routines were now impossible, and which ones simply required a different approach. He adapted. He was good at adapting. He told himself that every day. What he was not prepared for was what happened at his company while he was away. 6 months after his stroke, the board met. Marcus was not there. He was still in outpatient therapy, still working on the strength in his arms, still learning. The board met, and they voted. They cited concerns about leadership continuity. They cited the uncertainty of his medical future. They used careful words and formal language, and they moved very quickly. By the time his assistant called him, it was done. Hale Freight Solutions no longer had Marcus Hale as its chief executive. The company he had started with 1 truck and a cracked phone had removed him from his own desk. He did not fight it. He had the right to. His lawyer told him he had grounds to push back hard. He said no. He could not explain why exactly, except that fighting felt like it would cost him something he did not have left to spend. He signed what needed to be signed. He took the settlement. He went home. His wife had left the previous year, before the stroke, when the long hours and the constant travel had finally worn through what remained between them. That had been its own kind of quiet grief, the kind that does not announce itself but instead settles into the corners of a house, until one day you realize that every room feels too large. So Marcus Hale was alone in a house that felt too large, with no job to go back to, no feeling below his chest, and a settlement that paid the bills. He was not a man who sat still easily. He never had been. He had always needed something to move toward. Without a company to run, without a reason to be somewhere at 7 in the morning, the days became strange and long in ways he had not expected. He filled them as best he could. He read business books he had never had time for. He kept a journal. He worked with a physical therapist twice a week. He cooked simple meals and got reasonably good at it. He called his sister in Cleveland every Sunday. But there was a particular kind of loneliness that came not from being by yourself, but from watching people decide you were no longer worth their time. That kind of loneliness had a specific weight to it. It was heavier than the ordinary kind. After his stroke became public knowledge, the calls and messages had come in fast and warm. People who had worked with him for years, people who owed him favors, people who had sat across from him at dinner tables and said things like, "You are the kind of man this city needs more of." They reached out in the first weeks. Some of them came to see him. And then, slowly, the calls thinned. The visits stopped. Life went on for other people, in the way that life tends to do, and Marcus found himself on the receiving end of a silence that felt less like forgetfulness and more like a choice. He told himself he understood. He told himself it was not personal. He told himself this on the days when it was harder to believe. When his 52nd birthday came around, he did something he had not done in a long time. He tried. He reached into what was left of his old world, and he sent 17 invitations to 17 people who had, at one point or another, been part of his life. Former colleagues, old partners, a man he had mentored for 3 years who now ran a distribution company of his own, 2 people he had considered genuine friends. He sent proper invitations on proper paper, and he reserved a private room at the restaurant where he had signed his very first major contract, 21 years ago, over a plate of pasta he could barely afford, and a handshake that had changed the direction of his life. He wanted to feel connected again. That was all. He was not looking for pity. He was not looking for an audience. He simply wanted to sit at a table with people who had known him and eat a meal and feel, for one evening, like someone worth showing up for. 17 invitations. 3 people sent formal regrets within the first week. Scheduling conflicts, prior commitments, kind words. Marcus understood. He moved on. 2 people never responded at all. The others sent messages in the days leading up to the dinner. One had a family emergency. One was traveling. One simply said he was sorry but could not make it work, and he hoped Marcus had a wonderful evening. Another, a man Marcus had helped find financing for his first office space, sent a gift card with a note that said, "Thoughts are with you." A gift card, for his birthday, from a man whose business Marcus had helped save. By the morning of his birthday, Marcus had heard from all 17. None of them were coming. He went to the restaurant anyway. He was not entirely sure why. Some part of him thought perhaps someone might still show. Some part of him had not yet learned to stop expecting the people he had given his time and his trust to over 23 years to remember that he existed, now that he had nothing left to give them. He arrived at 6:30. Carl the waiter seated him at the head of the table. The candles were lit. The music played. The dark flowers sat in the centerpiece. 7:15 came and went. 7:30. Marcus drank his water. He looked at the 12 empty chairs. He looked at the 12 printed menu cards no one would read. He was not a man who cried easily, and he did not cry now. He felt something older and quieter than tears. He felt the particular weight of having done everything right and still ending up in an empty room. He picked up his fork. He was going to order dinner. He was going to eat it. He was going to go home. He was not going to let this be the night that finished him off. He was looking at the menu when he became aware that someone was watching him from the doorway. Not Carl. Not the manager. A man he had never seen before in his life. The man was standing just inside the entrance to the private room, holding the hand of a small girl with dark braids and bright eyes, and he was looking at Marcus the way people look at something they cannot quite decide what to do about. Marcus looked back. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Then the little girl tilted her head and said, in the perfectly direct way that only small children can manage, "Is it really your birthday?" Marcus looked at her. He said, "It is." She looked at the empty chairs. She looked at her father. She looked back at Marcus. "Then why is nobody here?" Marcus had no answer for that. Not one that would make sense to a 7-year-old. Not one that made much sense to him either, if he was honest. He had been sitting in that room for 45 minutes, and he still could not fully explain it to himself. He said, "I am not entirely sure." The little girl nodded, as if that was a reasonable answer. She tugged her father's hand. She said, "Dad." And the way she said it, just that one word, was enough. His name was Danny Ortega, and he had not planned any of this. He had planned a good dinner with his daughter. That was the whole plan. That was the entire scope of his ambition for that Tuesday evening, and it had taken him 3 months to get there. Danny was 34 years old and worked as a roofer for a company called Keller Brothers, which had been operating in the same city for 40 years and employed 11 people including Danny, who had been there for 6 of those years and was the fastest and most careful worker on the crew. His foreman, a quiet man named George Tanner who was 61 and had seen everything, had told Danny once that he had never met anyone who took more pride in a thing that most people never thought about. Danny had laughed at that. It was true, though. He thought about roofs. He thought about pitch and load and waterproofing, and the way a good seal around a chimney could hold for 30 years if you did it right. He found something satisfying in work that protected people without them ever having to think about it. A good roof was invisible. It just did its job. He had been doing his job well and quietly for 6 years, and then his wife, Carla, had died. It was an aneurysm. She was 31. She had been at the grocery store, standing in the cereal aisle, when it happened. She was gone before the ambulance arrived. There had been no warning. There had been no sign. One ordinary Tuesday, she had kissed Danny on the cheek before she left, and said she would be back in 40 minutes, and she was not. Paloma was 4 years old when her mother died. She was 7 now, and she remembered Carla in pieces, the way small children hold on to things, a smell, a color, the sound of a laugh. She had her mother's eyes, which Danny could not always look at directly, and her mother's habit of asking questions at exactly the wrong moment, and being exactly right to ask them. Danny raised her alone. He did not have family nearby. Carla's mother, a warm woman named Helen who lived 3 hours away, came when she could, and that was something. But the day-to-day was Danny and Paloma, and the small apartment they shared, and the routines they had built together. School drop-off at 7:40. Breakfast always at the table, never in the car. Dinner together every night that Danny was not on an emergency job. Sundays were for pancakes and a walk somewhere green if the weather held. He was not a perfect father, he knew that. He lost his patience sometimes at the end of long days, when his body ached from the work, and Paloma was asking for the 3rd time why they could not have a dog. He sometimes burned the rice because he was tired and not paying attention. He sometimes said he was fine when he was not fine at all. But he showed up every day. He got her to school on time. He made sure she had clean clothes and a full lunchbox and someone at every school event who clapped loudly for her when she stood up in front of the room. That was what he had. That was what he gave her. 3 months before the evening in question, Danny had decided to take Paloma somewhere genuinely nice for dinner, to celebrate her first day of 2nd grade. Not fast food, not the diner on the corner where the booths had ripped vinyl and the menus were laminated. Somewhere real. Somewhere with tablecloths and a waiter who introduced himself by name and food that took longer than 8 minutes to arrive. He had found the place online. It was called Brennan's. It had been there for decades. The reviews said it was the kind of restaurant that made regular people feel, for one evening, like they were something more than regular. Danny liked that description. He had saved carefully over those 3 months, setting aside a little each week from what was left after rent and utilities and the cost of everything a 7-year-old needs. He had made a reservation. He had told Paloma about it 2 weeks in advance, and she had talked about it almost every day since. They arrived on a Tuesday evening at 7 o'clock. The host led them past the main dining room, which was warm and full and smelled of something roasted and wonderful, and past a short hallway, and as they walked by the entrance to a private room, Paloma slowed down. Danny slowed down with her. Through the open doorway, he could see a large table set for what looked like 12 people. 12 chairs, 12 white plates, a centerpiece with dark flowers, candles burning low, soft music playing to nobody. And at the head of the table, a man in a wheelchair, sitting alone, reading a menu. Paloma stopped completely. Danny put his hand on her shoulder to guide her forward, toward their own table, toward the dinner he had planned and saved for and looked forward to. That was the reasonable thing to do. They had a reservation. They had a table. This was a private room for a private event that had nothing to do with them. He took one step. Paloma did not move. She was looking at the man at the table. She was looking at the empty chairs. She was looking at a birthday banner above the window, hand-lettered and slightly crooked, that said "Happy Birthday, Marcus," in cheerful letters, that now seemed to Danny like the saddest thing he had seen in a long time. He stood there. He was tired from work. His shoulders hurt. He had been looking forward to a simple, good evening. Just him and his daughter. A reward for the 3 months of careful saving. A memory to make. That was all he had wanted. He stood there for 4 minutes. He counted, because it was the kind of moment where you notice time passing in a way you usually do not. He thought about how it felt the first Christmas after Carla died, when he and Paloma had come downstairs to a tree and presents, and a perfectly ordinary morning, with an enormous absence in the center of it. He thought about how many times in the last 3 years he had sat at a table with an empty chair across from him, and tried to make ordinary conversation with a 4-year-old, who kept asking where Mama was. He thought about what it felt like to be the only person at a table that was meant for more than one. He looked at his daughter. She was still looking at the man in the room. She said, "Dad." Just that. Just his name. Danny Ortega took a breath. He took his daughter's hand. He walked through the doorway into the private room. Marcus looked up from the menu. Danny said, "I am sorry to walk in on you. We were going past and my daughter noticed you and I could not quite convince either of us to keep walking. I hope that is all right." Marcus looked at him for a moment. He looked at the little girl. He said, "It is all right." Paloma stepped forward. She asked, "Is it really your birthday?" Marcus told her it was. She asked why nobody was there. He said he was not entirely sure. She tugged her father's hand. Danny looked at his daughter, and in her face he saw the same thing he had seen in her face on a dozen mornings when she had climbed into his lap without being asked because she knew he was sad, even when he had not said so. She was not asking a question. She was telling him something. Danny looked at the man at the table. He said, "My name is Danny. This is Paloma. We have a reservation in the main room, but I wonder if you would mind if we ate in here instead. If you want company, you do not have to say yes." Marcus Hale, who had not cried in the restaurant, who had decided he was going to eat his dinner alone and go home with his dignity intact, looked at this stranger, and this small girl standing in the doorway of his empty room. He said, "I would like that very much." Danny asked the host if they could move their reservation. The host, a woman named Patricia who had worked at Brennan's for 11 years and had seen many things, said yes without hesitating. She moved the setting for 2 from the main room to the private room, and she did it quickly, and without making anyone feel strange about it. Danny pulled out a chair across from Marcus, close enough to talk without raising their voices. Paloma sat next to Danny. She put her hands flat on the tablecloth and looked around at all the empty chairs and then back at Marcus. She said, "This is a very big table." Marcus said, "It is." She said, "It is okay. Our table at home is also kind of big for 2 people." Marcus looked at her. He looked at Danny. Danny said quietly, "Her mother passed away 3 years ago." There was a brief silence, not an uncomfortable one, the kind of silence that comes when something true has been said and there is nothing to add to it immediately. Marcus said, "I am sorry." Danny said, "Thank you." Paloma said, "Can I look at the menu?" Danny handed her the menu. She held it with both hands and studied it with the intense focus of someone taking a very important exam. The waiter came. Carl, the young man who had been refilling Marcus's water glass all evening and looking away from the empty chairs, now looked at the table with something that was plainly relief. He greeted Danny and Paloma with warmth. He recited the specials. He made a small joke about the soup that Paloma found very funny. They ordered. While they waited for their food, they talked. It started with easy things. Danny asked about the restaurant, whether Marcus had been here before. Marcus told him about the first contract he had signed at this place, 21 years ago. He told it briefly, not as a story of triumph but as a memory he was fond of. A younger version of himself at a corner table with a man named Bill Garrett, who ran a warehouse on the east side of the city, eating pasta and signing a piece of paper that had felt at the time like holding lightning in his hands. Danny listened. He was a good listener. He did not fill every pause with talking, which Marcus noticed and appreciated. Paloma, who had been carefully coloring on the back of the paper menu with a crayon Carl had produced from somewhere, looked up and said, "Do you still have the trucks?" Marcus said, "No, I do not. Not anymore." She thought about this. Then she said, "That is okay. My dad does not have a mom anymore either." Danny looked at his daughter. Then he looked at the tablecloth. Marcus was quiet for a moment. He said, "Your dad seems like a very good one, though." Paloma said, "He burns the rice sometimes." Danny covered his face briefly with one hand. Marcus laughed. It was the first full laugh he had produced in longer than he could accurately remember. It came from somewhere he had thought was closed off. It was loud enough that Carl, passing in the hallway, smiled without knowing why. The food arrived. It was good. The kind of good that reminds you that a well-made meal is one of the uncomplicated pleasures of being alive. They ate, and they talked. Marcus told Danny a little about his company, about the early years, about what it had felt like to watch 64 trucks moving on a map in real time, and know that he had built every part of the system that made it work. He did not talk about losing it. Not yet. Some things take time. Danny told Marcus about roofing. He told him about the satisfaction of finishing a job, and knowing that the family inside that house would not think about their roof again for 25 years. He told him about George Tanner, his foreman, who had taught him everything technical, but had also modeled, without ever saying it directly, what it looked like to take quiet pride in work that nobody celebrated. Marcus listened the way he used to listen in meetings when someone was saying something worth hearing. Paloma finished her pasta and her lemonade, and grew sleepy in the way that children do at tables, slowly tipping toward vertical like a plant that needed water. Danny asked the waiter about dessert, and the waiter said they did not typically do birthday cakes, but he would speak to the kitchen. The kitchen, as it turned out, had flour and frosting, and the willingness to try. 20 minutes later, a small cake came out of the kitchen, imperfect and slightly uneven, with a single candle on top. Carl carried it. Patricia, the host, and 2 other staff members came to the door of the private room. Danny sang, slightly off-key. Paloma sang loudly and enthusiastically, and entirely in the wrong time signature. Marcus looked at the flame on the candle. He looked at this man he had not known 2 hours ago. He looked at this small girl who had asked a question in a doorway that nobody else had thought to ask. He thought about the 17 invitations sitting in 17 houses where people had read them and set them down and moved on with their evenings. He blew out the candle. He did not make a wish. He already had what he had needed. He did not cry at the table. He cried later, in the parking lot, after Danny and Paloma had said goodnight, and walked to their car, and Paloma had turned around one more time to wave at him with her whole arm. He sat alone in the parking lot for a few minutes with the cold air coming through the cracked window of his accessible van, and he cried in the way that people do when something they had given up on turns out to still be possible after all. Not because anything had been fixed. Not because the company was coming back or his legs were coming back or the 17 people had turned out to be good people after all. But because a man he did not know had walked through a doorway for no reason, except that it was the right thing to do, and a 7-year-old girl with her mother's eyes had sat across from him at a birthday table and told him, without knowing she was telling him anything, that the size of the table does not determine the quality of the meal. He wiped his face with the back of his hand. He started the van. He went home. Before he went to bed, he took out his phone. He opened the professional networking account he had not posted on in nearly a year. He looked at the photo Danny had taken before they left. The three of them at the table, candle wax still soft on the little cake, Paloma still faintly frosted at the corner of her mouth. He uploaded it. He wrote no caption. He wrote only, "My birthday dinner." He put the phone down on the nightstand. He lay in the dark for a while. He did not know what would happen next. He was not planning anything. He was not trying to make a point or get a reaction or prove something to the 17 people who had chosen not to come. He was simply a man who had gone to his own birthday party alone and come home having eaten the best meal he'd had in years, and he wanted, in the way that people sometimes want, to put one true thing out into the world before he closed his eyes. He slept better than he had in months. He woke up to 47 notifications. That was the first morning. By the time Danny Ortega had finished his breakfast across town and dropped Paloma at school and driven to the Keller Brothers job site on Fletcher Avenue, Marcus's post had been shared 900 times. Danny did not know any of this. He spent the morning on a roof. The job was a full replacement on a 2-story house belonging to a retired couple named the Garfields, who had dealt with a slow leak above their guest bedroom for 2 years before deciding to address the whole thing at once. Danny had given them a quote in September. They had said yes in October. The work had started Monday. This was Wednesday, and by midday they were making good progress. The crew was small on this job. Danny and 2 other men, a quiet 26-year-old named Eli who had been with Keller Brothers for 2 years, and a talkative 40-year-old named Frank, who had been doing this work since before Danny had known what a roof was. The 3 of them worked steadily. The weather was cooperative. George Tanner drove by in the early afternoon, looked up at the progress, nodded once, and drove away. That was high praise from George. Danny thought about the previous evening, the way you think about something when you are doing physical work that does not require your full attention. It surfaces in small pieces. The look on Marcus's face when Paloma sang. The way the man had laughed, sudden and full. The frosting on his daughter's face that she had somehow not noticed. He thought, on and off throughout the day, about the weight of what he had seen in that doorway. A man sitting alone at a table set for 12. A birthday banner no one was there to read. He had known the right thing to do in that moment, with the kind of clarity that did not come from thinking, but from something simpler. The same thing that made him check on a neighbor who had not put out her bins for 2 weeks. The same thing that made him let the person behind him in the grocery line go first when they were holding 1 item and he was holding 12. He did not think of himself as an unusually good person. He thought of himself as someone who paid attention. He picked up Paloma from school at 3:15. She got into the car and said, "Someone at school said my dad was on the internet." Danny looked at her in the rearview mirror. "What?" "Chloe said she saw a picture of you with a man in a wheelchair and a birthday cake." Danny frowned. He drove. He thought for a moment. Then he reached for his phone at a red light, which he knew he should not do, and opened the message thread from Marcus. Marcus had texted that morning. Danny had seen it and told himself he would read it properly later, and then had not gotten back to it. He pulled into a parking spot a block from the school and read the message. Marcus had written, "I posted the photo last night. I wanted to tell you before you saw it somewhere else. It has been shared quite a bit. I hope that is all right. I owe you more than I know how to put into a text message. Thank you for walking through that door." Danny looked at the text. He looked at Paloma in the back seat. She was eating a cracker from her bag and watching him with calm, patient eyes. He opened the post. The number on the share count had moved past 14,000. Danny sat in the parked car for a long moment. He was not a person who used social media much. He had an account he checked occasionally, mostly to see photos that Carla's mother posted of her garden. The idea that a photo of him and his daughter and a man he had met the previous evening was now being seen by 14,000 strangers was, to put it plainly, a great deal to take in while sitting in a car eating a cracker. Paloma said, "Are you okay, Dad?" He said, "Yes, I think so. Something happened with the picture from last night." She said, "The birthday picture?" He said, "Yes." She considered this. She said, "Is Marcus famous?" Danny said, "I do not think so. Not the usual kind." She said, "Is he famous now?" Danny looked at the share count. which had moved again while he was sitting there. He said, "Maybe a little." By the time they got home, and Danny had made dinner, the number was past 22,000. By the time Paloma was in bed, and Danny was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea he had made, and mostly forgotten about, it was past 30,000. His phone had begun ringing from numbers he did not recognize. He did not answer them. He texted Marcus, "I just saw all of this. Are you doing okay?" Marcus replied within 2 minutes, "Honestly, I am not sure. It is a lot. But yes, I think I am okay. How are you?" Danny wrote, "A little surprised." Marcus wrote, "Me too." Danny wrote, "Paloma is pleased. She told me she hoped Marcus was having a good day." There was a pause. Then Marcus wrote, "Tell her I am now." Danny smiled at that. He put the phone down. He finished the cold tea. He washed the cup. He went to check on Paloma, who was asleep, with one arm hanging off the mattress, in the specific boneless way that children sleep, when they are fully and completely out. He stood in the doorway of her room for a moment. He thought about the fact that his daughter had been the one to stop. He had been the one to walk through the door, yes, but she had been the one who stopped moving and would not be moved. She had seen something that he had almost walked past. He thought about Carla, who had been the same way, who had never walked past a thing that needed attending to, who had once, on their third date, stopped in the middle of a sidewalk to help a woman untangle a stroller wheel that had caught on a grate, and Danny had stood there watching and thought, without any doubt at all, that this was the woman he was going to love for the rest of his life. He turned off Paloma's light. He went to bed. The next morning, the share count was past 40,000. His foreman George called him before he left for the job site. George was not a man who called people without a specific reason. He said, "I saw that picture on my granddaughter's phone last night. That was a kind thing you did, Danny." Danny said, "Paloma was the one who stopped." George was quiet for a moment. He said, "Then she is going to be all right." Danny said, "Yes, sir. I think she is." At the job site, Frank greeted him with a wide grin and said, "There he is. The most famous roofer in the state." Danny told him to get back on the roof. Frank went, still grinning. Eli said nothing about it, which Danny appreciated. By Thursday afternoon, journalists had found the Post. 2 local news outlets ran short pieces. A regional morning show reached out to Marcus's assistant. A writer for a national publication sent a message asking if Marcus would be willing to talk. A podcast about personal resilience sent a very long email. By Friday, something else happened. A venture capital firm called Meridian Group, which had offices downtown, and whose name Danny recognized vaguely from billboards near the highway, sent an email to Marcus. Danny learned about this on Saturday when Marcus called him. Marcus said, "I want to tell you about something, and I want to be straightforward with you, because you have earned that." He told Danny about the email from Meridian Group. He told him that 2 other business inquiries had come in since the Post. He told him that a woman who ran a nonprofit focused on disability employment had reached out to say she had been looking for someone with Marcus's specific background in logistics for more than a year. Danny listened. Marcus said, "None of this is why I posted the photo. I want you to know that. I posted it because it was a true thing that happened, and I wanted to put something true into the world before I went to sleep. That is all." Danny said, "I know that." Marcus said, "But things are moving now that were not moving before, and I wanted you to know, because you are part of why." Danny was quiet for a moment. He said, "I just moved our table." Marcus said, "You moved a great deal more than that." Danny did not know what to say to that. He was not comfortable with being credited for things. He was comfortable with work. He was comfortable with showing up and doing the practical thing and going home. Being seen as the cause of something larger than a moved table was unfamiliar territory. He said, "How is Paloma going to react when I tell her she is famous?" Marcus said, "She is going to take it in stride. She is that kind of person." Danny said, "She really is." They talked for a while longer. Before they hung up, Marcus said, "I would like to keep in touch, if you are willing. Not because of any of this. Because I like talking to you." Danny said, "I would like that too." He hung up. He went to the living room, where Paloma was on the floor, building something complicated with blocks. He said, "Marcus called." She did not look up. She said, "Is he okay?" He said, "Yes, he is good, actually. Things are looking up for him." She said, "Good," and placed a block very carefully on top of another block. "I told you his birthday got better." Danny sat down on the couch. He said, "You did tell me that." She said, "He seemed nice." He said, "He is nice." She said, "Dad?" He said, "Yeah?" She placed one more block. She said, "Can we go back to that restaurant sometime?" The food was really good. Danny looked at his daughter. He thought about the 3 months of saving. He thought about Carla. He thought about a man at a table alone, and a doorway he had almost walked past. He said, "Yes, we can definitely do that." She said, "Good." She looked at her block tower. She said, "I am going to make this one taller than the last one." Danny watched her build. Outside, the Saturday morning light came through the window at a low angle and spread across the floor in a long, warm stripe. The apartment was small. The table in the kitchen was a little large for two. The day ahead had no particular plan. Danny thought that was fine. The best things, he had come to understand, tended to walk through the door unplanned. 3 weeks after the dinner at Brennan's, Marcus Hale sat at the desk in his home office and looked at a document he had been working on for 11 days. It was not a business plan exactly. It was more like the beginning of a map. He had learned, in 23 years of running a company, that the most important part of starting something was not the funding, or the pitch, or the office space. It was the moment when a person stopped asking whether something was possible and started asking what it would actually require. That shift in the question was everything. He had spent the first 18 months after his stroke asking the wrong question. He had been asking whether he could still be the person he used to be, and the answer to that question was no, and he had been unable to move past it because he had not yet understood that it was the wrong thing to ask. What had changed, in ways that were still becoming clear to him, was that a man named Danny Ortega and his 7-year-old daughter Paloma had walked through a door and eaten birthday cake with him, and something in that had quietly rearranged the furniture of his thinking. The right question, as it turned out, was not whether he could be who he had been. The right question was what he could build from where he actually was. He had spent 23 years building a logistics company. He knew supply chains and freight networks and distribution systems the way a musician knows scales. He knew that world cold. He also knew, now, what it meant to be a person who had been written off by people who could not see past a changed circumstance. He knew what it felt like when an institution decided that your difference made you a liability rather than an asset. He thought about that a great deal. He had been contacted, in the weeks following the post, by 41 people who had disabilities of various kinds and who worked in logistics or transportation or supply chain management, or who had worked in those fields before illness or injury and had been quietly moved aside. They reached out through his professional network, through the comment section of the post, through the nonprofit that had contacted him. Their stories were different in their particulars but similar in the thing underneath. They were capable. They were experienced. They were invisible. Marcus read every message. He wrote back to all 41. He did not have a company yet. He did not have funding finalized. He had a document on his desk that was part business plan and part map and part argument that he was still working through. But he had been building things out of less for most of his life, and he knew that the materials came together when the intention was clear. The intention was clear. He was going to build a consultancy. It would specialize in placing workers with physical disabilities into logistics and supply chain roles, and it would work on both ends of the relationship, advising companies on structural accessibility and advising candidates on how to present and position their experience. It would be staffed by people who understood the field from the inside because they had lived it. It would not be a charity. It would be a business, and it would operate with the same demanding standards that Marcus had held himself and everyone around him to for 23 years. He had a meeting that afternoon with a woman named Claire Dawson, who ran the disability employment nonprofit, and had reached out the same week the post went live. She had a background in human resources and a network of employer relationships and a deep frustration with the gap between what companies said they valued and what their hiring practices actually reflected. She had been looking, as she told Marcus on their first call, for someone who could give her organization credibility in the logistics sector, because credibility in that sector required having actually run operations, not just studied them. Marcus could offer that. Claire could offer connections and a structure that would take years to build from scratch. There was also the matter of Meridian Group. The venture capital firm had sent an email, then followed up with a call, and the call had led to a meeting, and the meeting had led to a proposal that Marcus was still considering. The money was real. The terms were not unfair. But Marcus had spent enough time in boardrooms to know that the moment someone else's capital entered the equation, the direction of a thing became a negotiation rather than a decision. He was not opposed to the negotiation. He was simply being careful. He had talked to Danny about it. Not because Danny had expertise in venture capital. He did not. But somewhere in the 3 weeks since the birthday dinner, Danny Ortega had become the person Marcus called when he wanted to think out loud. He was not sure exactly how that had happened. It had happened the way things sometimes do. Not through a formal decision, but through a series of small moments that added up, without anyone noticing, to something that mattered. Danny listened well. He asked questions that were direct and practical, and occasionally came from such a different world than the one Marcus usually occupied, that they cut through the noise in a useful way. When Marcus had explained the Meridian Group proposal and its various conditions and stipulations, Danny had been quiet for a moment and then said, "Does it let you run the thing the way you want to run it, or does it let them tell you how?" Marcus had said the second option was a risk. Danny had said, "Then that is the thing to figure out first, and everything else comes after." Marcus had thought about that for 2 days. He was still thinking about it. He had also, in the past 3 weeks, talked to Danny about something else. Something he had been turning over in his mind since their conversation the night of his birthday, when Danny had talked about his work with a kind of quiet pride that Marcus recognized and respected. He picked up his phone and called. Danny answered on the second ring. He was on a job site, which Marcus could tell from the background sound. Marcus said, "Are you somewhere you can talk for a few minutes?" Danny said, "Give me 2 minutes." There was the sound of footsteps, a brief exchange with someone named Eli, and then quiet. Danny said, "Okay, what is going on?" Marcus said, "I want to offer you a job." There was a pause. Danny said, "I already have a job." Marcus said, "I know. I am asking you to consider a different one." He explained it, not in full corporate presentation language, but the way he had learned to explain things when he had first been hiring people for his trucking company 20 years ago. Plain and honest and specific about what he was asking for and what he was offering in return. He told Danny that the consultancy was going to need people who could walk into a warehouse or a distribution facility and immediately understand the operational environment. People who could talk to a floor manager and earn credibility in the first 5 minutes because they had clearly done real physical work. People who had the kind of practical intelligence that comes from years of problem solving in conditions where the problem does not wait for you to schedule a meeting about it. He told Danny that what he had done in that restaurant doorway, the act of noticing something and then doing something about it without needing anyone to tell him to, was exactly the kind of judgment Marcus needed on his team. He told Danny what the salary would be. It was more than Danny was currently making, not by an enormous amount, but enough to matter. He said, "I am not asking you because of the photo, or because I feel like I owe you something. I am asking you because I have spent 23 years building a business, and I know what useful looks like, and you are useful in ways that are not common." The line was quiet. Danny said, "I do not know anything about consulting." Marcus said, "You know what good work looks like. You know how to talk to people who do physical work. You know how to walk into a situation, read it, and do the right thing without waiting for permission. I can teach you the rest." Another pause. Danny said, "Can I think about it?" Marcus said, "Yes. Take your time." Danny said, "What does this actually look like day to day?" Marcus said, "We would visit facilities, talk to employers, help match people with disabilities to roles that fit their actual capabilities. You would be in the field, which you are already comfortable with. The difference is, you would be doing it on behalf of people who have been told they do not fit." Danny was quiet for a long moment. He said, "George Tanner told me once that I notice things other people walk past." Marcus said, "He was right." Danny said, "Let me talk to George, and let me talk to Paloma." Marcus almost smiled. He said, "She gets a vote?" Danny said, "She always gets a vote." Marcus said, "Fair enough." They hung up. Marcus sat at his desk and looked at the document in front of him. The map was getting clearer. The intention had not changed. He thought about the 17 people who had not come to his birthday dinner. He had been thinking about them less and less, he noticed, and that itself felt like a form of progress. Not forgiveness exactly, because he was honest enough to admit that he did not fully know yet what he felt about it. But the pull of it was weakening. The daily tally of who had chosen not to show up was losing its grip on the part of his mind where he used to keep it. He thought about what Paloma had said. Our table at home is also kind of big for 2 people. He thought about what it meant to say something like that and keep going, to look at the size of what was missing, and then put your hands flat on the tablecloth and open the menu and carry on. He had a lot to learn from a 7-year-old. He saved the document. He closed the laptop. He had 40 minutes before Claire Dawson arrived. He went to make coffee, which he had learned to make very well in the 18 months of long mornings alone, and he looked out the kitchen window at the street below, where the ordinary afternoon was doing its ordinary things. People walking, a delivery truck idling, a woman with a stroller moving at the unhurried pace of someone with nowhere to be for a little while. He thought, this is still a life. He had not believed that for a long time. He was starting to believe it again. That was enough for now. That was, in fact, more than enough. Danny Ortega told George Tanner about the job offer on a Thursday morning, standing beside the Keller brothers' van in the parking lot of a supply house where they had stopped to pick up material. George listened. He had his coffee in one hand and his eyes on the middle distance, the way he always did when he was taking something in properly. He did not interrupt. When Danny finished, George was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You going to take it?" Danny said, "I do not know yet." George said, "What is holding you back?" Danny said, "It is a change. And change is hard when you have a kid and a routine and things are stable." George said, "Stable is not the same as good." Danny looked at him. George said, "You are a good roofer, Danny. You are one of the best I have had. But you have been good at this since your 3rd year. You have not been growing in 6. A man like you needs somewhere to grow." Danny said, "What does that mean for you if I go?" George said, "It means I find another roofer. That is my problem, not yours. Do not factor me in." Danny said, "You trained me." George said, "That is what training is for, so the person can move." They stood there in the parking lot, while a forklift moved a pallet of material somewhere behind them. George said, "What does Paloma think?" Danny said, "I told her last night. She asked what Marcus would be doing. I said helping people who had trouble finding jobs. She thought about it for about 4 seconds and then said, 'That sounds right for Marcus,' and then she went back to her blocks." George looked at his coffee. He said, "She sounds like her mother." Danny did not say anything for a moment. He said, "Yes." George finished his coffee. He crushed the cup in one hand. He said, "Give the man your answer." Danny gave Marcus his answer that afternoon. He said, "I will take the job, but I need 6 weeks to transition properly with Keller Brothers, because I owe George that." Marcus said, "6 weeks is fine." Danny said, "And I want to be honest with you. I am going to make mistakes. I have never done anything like this." Marcus said, "Neither had I when I started, and I had 6 weeks of savings in one truck. You have more than I did." Danny said, "What do I have?" Marcus said, "You have good judgment. That is the thing that cannot be taught. Everything else is learnable." Danny said, "Okay." Marcus said, "Okay." There was a brief pause, the comfortable kind that exists between people who have already said the important things. Danny said, "Paloma is going to want to know when we can visit the office." Marcus said, "Tell her she is welcome any time. She can have my best chair." Danny said, "She is going to hold you to that." Marcus said, "I am counting on it." In the weeks that followed, the consultancy, which Marcus named Hail Forward, began to take real shape. Claire Dawson joined as a co-founder. bringing her nonprofit network and her relentless knowledge of the employer landscape. Marcus spent long days at his desk and on calls, rebuilding connections in the logistics world, not from a position of power this time, but from the more honest position of a man who understood the field deeply and needed others to trust that understanding. It was slower than building the freight company had been. He had fewer resources and more resistance, and a world that had not yet decided how seriously to take him. But it was moving. He reached out, one at a time, to the 41 people who had sent him messages after the post. He did not have jobs for all of them yet. What he had was honesty, an explanation of what he was building, and when he thought it might be ready, and what role, if any, they might eventually play in it. Most of them wrote back. A few of them became early advisors. 2 of them became his first-placed candidates, matching with a regional freight company, whose operations director, a practical woman named Diane Graves, had responded to Marcus's outreach with 3 direct questions, and then a yes. Those were the 2 placements that made it real. He sent Diane a handwritten note afterward. He had not written a handwritten note in years. It felt like the right thing to do. And through all of it, the 17 people who had not come to his birthday dinner remained absent. A few of them had sent messages after the post went viral, brief and warm and carefully worded messages that said things like, "So good to see you are doing well." Marcus read them. He did not respond to most of them, not out of spite, but because he found, to his own quiet surprise, that he did not have anything he particularly wanted to say. He had spent a long time waiting for those people to remember him. He understood now that the waiting had been costing him something, and that what it had cost him was the energy and attention he should have been putting somewhere else. He was putting it somewhere else now. He was putting it into a business that needed him, and a team that was forming around a shared purpose, and a friendship with a roofer who had walked through a doorway for no reason, except that it was right. He was putting it into phone calls with Paloma, who had strong opinions about what color his office should be painted, and was disappointed to learn it was already painted, and he was not going to redo it. He was putting it into the slow, daily work of rebuilding a life that looked different from the one he had lost but was beginning to feel, in ways he could not have described 6 months ago, like his own. There was an afternoon in late November, 2 months after the birthday dinner, when Marcus drove past the restaurant. He was not going there. He was coming back from a meeting, and the route took him past it. He slowed without planning to. He looked at the front door. He thought about the candles burning down into the centerpiece. He thought about Carl refilling his water glass and looking away. He thought about the moment before Danny Ortega walked through the entrance to the private room, when Marcus had been sitting alone with the menu and telling himself he was going to eat his dinner and go home with his dignity intact. He thought about how close he had been to simply doing exactly that, to eating his dinner and going home and letting the night be the thing it had threatened to be. And then he thought about a little girl with dark braids standing in a doorway asking why nobody was there. He drove on. He had a call in 20 minutes. He had a document to finish after that. He had a team that was small and imperfect and still figuring out what it was supposed to be. He had somewhere to be. The days, which had been long and strange and full of rooms that felt too large, had become shorter without his noticing. They had become full, not in the loud, constant way they used to be, when the company had been everything, and he had run on caffeine and urgency, and the particular intoxication of watching something he had built keep getting larger. This was different, quieter, more deliberate. He found that he preferred it. On a Saturday morning in December, Marcus drove to Danny's apartment for the first time. Paloma had been asking. Danny had mentioned it twice without pressure, the way Danny did everything, without pushing, but also without letting it fall away. Marcus had not been to anyone's home in more than a year. The apartment was on the 3rd floor of a building with a working elevator, which Danny had told him about in advance without making a thing of it. The hallway smelled of someone's cooking. The door had a small hand-painted sign that Paloma had clearly made herself, with the name Ortega in large wobbly letters, and a drawing of a house with a very large roof. Danny opened the door. Paloma appeared immediately behind him, as if she had been waiting at close range for some time, which she probably had. She said, "You came." Marcus said, "I came." She said, "I made the sign. The roof is because my dad fixes roofs. I put a lot of shingles on." He looked at the sign more carefully. The roof had, indeed, a significant number of shingles. He said, "That is an impressive roof." She said, "I know." They had pancakes, because it was Saturday, and that was the rule. Danny made them from scratch. Paloma sat next to Marcus at the small kitchen table, which was, as she had mentioned, a little large for two people, and showed him a drawing she had made of the three of them at the birthday dinner. In the drawing, the birthday cake had a great number of candles, and everyone was smiling very widely, and there was a speech bubble coming from Marcus that said, "Yay." Marcus looked at the drawing for a long moment. He said, "Can I keep this?" She said, "I made it for you." He said, "Thank you, Paloma." She said, "You are welcome," with the simple directness of someone who knew that a thank you was the correct response, and had no complicated feelings about receiving it. Danny poured coffee. The morning light came through the kitchen window. The pancakes were very good. They ate and they talked, and the time went in the easy, unhurried way that time goes when the people at the table are glad to be where they are. At one point, Paloma said, "Marcus, do you like your new job?" He said, "I am still building it. But yes, I like it very much." She said, "My dad says you are helping people who got left out." He said, "That is a good way to put it." She thought about this with the same intense focus she had brought to the birthday menu. Then she said, "I think that is important." Marcus said, "So do I." She went back to her pancakes. Danny looked at the table. The morning held. Later, as Marcus was leaving, he stopped in the doorway of the apartment and looked back at the small kitchen, at Danny washing dishes at the sink, and Paloma carrying her plate with both hands, the way children do when they are trying very hard to be careful. He thought about all the things that had come from a single decision made at a restaurant doorway on a Tuesday evening, a post that had spread to corners he would never see, a partnership with Claire, a consultancy with its first real placements, a friendship that he had not gone looking for, and could not now imagine not having, a drawing of a birthday party in a child's hand that was going on the wall of his home office as soon as he got home. He thought about what the evening of his birthday had been before Danny walked through that door. He thought about what it had become. And he thought about what his father had written in the note left behind after he died. "Do not waste the years." He had not understood it fully at 30, when he had taken it as a directive toward ambition. He understood it differently now. He understood it as something simpler, as a reminder that the years had value, not because of what you built in them, or how large the thing became, but because of what you put into them that lasted. A business that served people who had been told they did not fit. A man who had learned to show up for strangers with the same reliability with which he showed up for work. A little girl who stopped in doorways to ask the questions that needed asking. He drove home. He hung the drawing on the wall of his office. He made tea and sat at his desk and looked at the document that was still a map, but becoming something more specific every day. He did not look at the names of the 17 people. He had stopped keeping the list. That was the end of the waiting. That was, in the end, the thing he had needed to do last, and the thing that had taken the longest, and the thing that, once done, felt less like a loss than like setting down something heavy he had been carrying for too long. He was 52 years old. He was building something new. He had a team and a purpose and a friend who burned the rice sometimes, and a small girl who put a lot of shingles on things. He had somewhere to be in the morning. He picked up his pen. He got back to work.